Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel. Today we'll be discussing a really interesting topic that's been going around a lot in the world of psychedelics recently, IP and patents. As implied by the title of this panel, there are both challenges and opportunities around patents and IP in psychedelics, and we're going to have some speakers who will be able to speak to both these points, mostly from an investor's perspective. Before we sort of get going, I am going to kick this over to Richard. Richard Chung is General Counsel at the Noetic Fund, and he's going to be giving us a short presentation on this topic in particular. So, Richard, go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Yeji, for the introduction, and thanks for the organizing team for the invitation to speak today. They put together a fantastic program, and I'm looking forward to participating. So, a year ago today, the world was in the early days of the pandemic, and I was a partner in the IP group of a large full-service Canadian law firm in Toronto. And for over 15 years, I've been practicing as a patent lawyer, which included things like drafting patents, guiding them through the patent office, and providing opinions with respect to patents, taking part in litigation, and developing commercialization strategies for various intellectual property assets. With the background in pharmacy and a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, my clients were mainly in the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device sectors. Late last August, a mutual friend connected me with one of the Noetic partners who was interested in talking about IP in the psychedelic industry. I didn't know it at the time, but the conversations we had over the next several months marked a new phase in my professional life. And over time, I met the other Noetic partners, and before I knew it, I was spending a lot of time thinking about the unique IP challenges and opportunities in the industry and the tremendous potential of psychedelic-based therapies for patients in need. So needless to say, I was very excited by the opportunity to join Noetic as their general counsel. So that's how I came to be standing before you today, a relative newcomer to an industry with a fierce debate around patents involving psychedelics. On one side, there are those who are wary of patents because there's a concern that they could overreach and stifle the industry, both commercial and non-commercial uses, such as ritualistic or indigenous or in the underground settings. On the other side of the debate are those who adhere to more traditional drug development strategies of using patents to raise funding or to balance out the high failure rate associated with bringing a drug to market. So as the industry grapples with these important issues, I thought it'd be helpful to take a step back and briefly consider some of the fundamental patent principles and how they might be applied to the psychedelic space. Now, the logical place to start, I think, is what is a patent? A patent can be viewed as a contract or a bargain between an inventor and the government, whereby the inventor discloses all of the details of the patented invention in exchange for a time-limited exclusive right or a monopoly to make, use, and sell the invention. How do you get a patent? Well, in general, to obtain a patent, the invention must be found by the patent office to be novel or not previously disclosed to the public, useful or works for its intended purpose, and not obvious. So it's not obvious to someone of average skill in the field of invention. In addition, the invention must also be considered patentable subject matter, which can vary from country to country. So there are a lot of things you can patent, including dosage forms, formulations, new chemical entities, and delivery systems, among other things. But there are also things that you cannot patent, such as natural products, like in the US, higher life forms, such as in Canada, as well as methods of medical treatment, also in Canada. Now, while some countries used to grant patents on a first to invent basis, all countries now use a first to file system. This means that the right to grant of a patent for a given invention lies with the first person to file a patent application for the protection of the invention. So regardless of the date of actual invention, in some cases, it quite literally is a race to the patent office. It's also important to distinguish between the patent document you're looking at, whether it's a patent application versus an issued patent. An issued patent is one that has been examined and allowed by a patent office. The boundaries of the patent are clearly defined by the patent claims. The patent application, however, is still undergoing examination by the Patent Office. They are typically published 18 months after the filing date as part of this contract or bargain between the applicant and the government. And during the examination of applications, the scope of the claims will change and likely change significantly, depending on the prior art that's found by the examiner, or including like the publicly available knowledge that the patent examiner is able to uncover. So importantly, although the scope of the claims can change, the applicant is limited to whatever is within the four corners of the patent as filed. So that's to say that once it's filed, the applicant can't add any new subject matter to the patent application. So also there's an awareness in the psychedelic space of the need to be extra diligent with prior art due to the fact that a lot of knowledge may be found in non-traditional sources or away from the traditional scientific journals and patent databases. It's also important to keep in mind that patents are country specific or have geographic limits. So that's to say that if you had a patent in the US or Japan, for example, you couldn't enforce either of those patents in Europe. So there are ways to challenge both the scope and validity of patents. And the simplest is to leave it up to the patent office to uncover prior art and to raise objections to the application during examination. There's also other ways, however, for interested parties to intervene, including actively providing prior art to the patent office. It's notable that in the US, there's also a positive obligation on the applicant to notify the patent office of any material that's relevant to the patentability of the invention. There's also requests for examination that are available, an inter-parties review process in the US, as well as opposition proceedings in Europe, as well as court challenges that are possible in various countries as well. So with those fundamental patent principles in mind, we can start to understand how it is that some patent applications can appear to be overly broad. So when you have a situation like we're seeing in the psychedelic space, where multiple parties are rushing to the patent office in a relatively short time frame in order to beat their competitors, and then you factor in the 18-month confidentiality period for applications, it's difficult for interested parties to know the subject matter of previously filed applications. So given the pressure to file, one strategy to manage the risk of applying for something that's already the subject of an earlier filed application is to put a lot of material into the application to give the applicant the ability to maneuver around subject matter that's been previously filed or disclosed during examination phase of an application. This is especially true since you can't add any additional subject matter to your application once it's filed. So the counter to a seemingly overbroad patent is to take advantage of the procedures in place to challenge the scope of the validity of the patent, which I believe has already been attempted in the industry. Now, to the extent that concerns exist about patenting natural products, we can look to the statutory bars in place for patents on products of nature, or the fact that some of the time these natural products may already be in the public domain. So one example we can pull from the biotech space is to highlight some of the approaches that can be taken when it comes to natural products involves a drug called Taxol. This is a Canadian case involving an innovative drug company that isolated a medicine called paclitaxel from the Pacific yew tree for treating cancers. A number of Canadian patents were obtained relating to the drug, but not to the drug itself, since it was already in the public domain. A small biotech company recognized that there was a potential supply problem for the drug because the compound had to be extracted from the bark of the plant, which killed the slow-growing bush. The biotech company discovered that the drug could be extracted or obtained from another source without killing the plant, and that it also had additional indications. So the biotech company produced its own trials and brought their own version of the drug onto the Canadian market. And while the series of court cases revolved mainly around regulatory issues, from an IP perspective, it's notable that the innovator company did not allege that its patents would be infringed by the biotech company. So from an IP perspective, I think that the most likely outcome is that there may be multiple pathways when bringing a medicine to market. There doesn't appear to be a one-size-fits-all approach. Patents have traditionally been a good way to incentivize and encourage research, but there may also be other viable approaches, especially when you consider the breadth and depth of knowledge that could reside in non-traditional sources of information. Also, adhering to an anti-patent approach should also be balanced by the possibility that companies would simply shift to a trade secret strategy, effectively preventing any disclosure of inventions and potentially slowing the pace of innovation. Overlaying all of these issues is the fact that psychedelics have significant cultural, spiritual, and indigenous uses. So there's a high bar for ethical considerations in the space as well. As an organization, Noetic supports innovation and is of the view that products of nature and knowledge in the industry that has long been in the public domain should not be the subject of a patent. While there's huge potential for psychedelic based medicines to positively impact mental health illness, there are likely multiple approaches for realizing this potential in a manner that is still respectful to what has come before. It's tremendously exciting time to be a part of the psychedelic industry, and I can't wait to see what comes next. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That was a really great overview of the whole complicated patent process. Now joining us is Tim. Tim Schlidt is a partner at Palo Santo. And I'm just going to give a short overview of both our panelists before I sort of let them take over. So like I said, Tim, partner at Palo Santo, a fund focused on psychedelics. Richard Chung is also general counsel at the Noetic Fund, also focused on psychedelics. I'm going to let you guys take it from here and sort of give a short intro of yourselves, your backgrounds, how you sort of came into the world of psychedelics. So Tim, why don't we start with you? Tim, I think you're on mute.
I should probably fix that. There we go. I was just saying, yeah, happy to kick things off. And Richard, great intro there. But a little background on me. I started my career in finance. So started at JP Morgan in the healthcare group, moved over to Greenhill & Company, which had a very active life sciences practice. So during my early career was very active in kind of biotech finance and in financial advisory services. And then from there, moved over to Madison Dearborn Partners, which is a Chicago-based private equity firm. And during my time there was really focused more on healthcare services. So the way I like to segment my career was the first part was really the R&D and kind of developing the products and helping companies on that side really from a capital market standpoint. And then on the healthcare services side, it's more thinking about delivery of those products. How do those roll out in a clinic-based model or even healthcare tech, that whole side of the continuum. So gave me a really nice perspective of kind of the full spectrum of healthcare as a commercial opportunity. And I think that's paid off really well as we've seen psychedelics go more of a medicalized route rather than a recreational route. I think it's, certainly going down a different course than we saw with cannabis. So a little bit of background on Palo Santo. This has been the product of an effort between me, my business partner, Daniel Goldberg, and then also our partner, Tony Eisenberg, who's joined us. And I met Daniel a few years back. Mental health has always been near and dear to my heart. Met on this topic about 3 years ago, just at a very personal level and exploring it. We became very fascinated about psychedelic science in general. And then over time, it evolved into a commercial interest. And with COVID, that was really the catalyst where we said, wow, there's a huge mental health crisis. Daniel comes from a VC background. I've got a healthcare background. It seemed like a great pairing, and it's a really big space. So saw the opportunity, started Palo Santo, and it's been great. And we've collaborated with Noetic on a number of things. I know we're in a number of investments together, and it's really exciting to be in a fast growing space where everyone can be collaborating and really moving things forward. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Tim. Richard, go ahead.
Thanks, Yeji. So I come from it as a pharmacist initially by training, and then went back to do my PhD in pharmaceutical sciences, focusing on drug delivery in the cancer space. In law school, I always, because of my background, had a big interest in intellectual property in the life sciences space. So that's how I came to sort of this world of patents and IP. And I've did a little bit of litigation between pharma and big pharma and generic companies, and also tried my hand in drafting patents and bringing through the patent office, licensing patents and IP, commercializing things, and also wore a bit of a regulatory hat as well, and in the Canadian marketplace. So bringing drugs and medical devices onto the Canadian market and making sure they're in compliance with all the federal and provincial regulations. So like Tim, I think, over the past year, certainly sort of shed a spotlight on the significant issues with mental health and the current treatments that may not be the whole solution to people with mental health illness. So when this opportunity came around, and just sort of looking at the tremendous potential for disruptive change in the industry, it was almost a no-brainer to move on over and to see, to play a little part in helping to bring these medicines to market.
Thanks, both. Now, I know there are a lot of ways we can approach this topic, and I think we're all aware there are a lot of differing opinions of how big of a role patents should play in the realm of psychedelics. But, why don't we just start off with this big question? And this is for both of you. Should psychedelic companies approach patents differently than other companies looking to develop medications? Why or why not? Richard, why don't we start with you, and Tim, feel free to jump in at any point.
Sure, that's a big question, and I think that yes, I do think so, just because of the place that psychedelics has played in culture and society, and whether it's sort of cultural or spiritual or indigenous sort of uses, there's just a higher bar for ethical considerations in the space, as well. Sort of from a patent perspective, when you look at the fundamental underpinnings of the patent system, prior art and public knowledge of the psychedelic space is different, just because there may be a whole wealth of knowledge just not available in traditional sources that you might look at, whether they're medical journals or the patent system, or previous patent applications or whatnot. They might be just sort of oral tradition or underground uses, right? That just were not written down or searchable in a database. So it's important, if you pursue a patent strategy, to be mindful and thoughtful of it. And it's similar, but to sort of other, like to traditional strategies, but also a little bit different, because I think you have to put just a little bit more thought into how you search those those traditional sources of information.
Yeah, I mean, I think you absolutely have to be respectful of tradition here. I think, once you get to brass tacks on a lot of these, and once you start looking at the specifics, you realize that pharma's hands are pretty tied, no matter which way you cut it anyway. I mean, no one can patent psilocybin. You can patent polymorph forms or methods of delivery. But, what you find from that is the IP band is a lot more narrow. I mean, the holy grail in life sciences investing is composition of matter, right? And just no one's going to get that around these substances unless you're doing, really novel R&D, which we are certainly leaning into that quite a bit more. Palo Santo, I think, moving beyond the generics and trying to go for companies that are working on new chemical entities. But I think you certainly have to be mindful of that. But with that said, I mean, Compass has kind of been the boogeyman in the room in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of people. I mean, their band of IP is on that polymorph form. If someone were to do a psilocybin infusion, for example, or have, some other prodrug form to deliver psilocin, you name it, I mean, they could certainly advance that in their own way, and there's no way for Compass to block that. And then the other thing is, biotech companies can't get in the way of physicians and their patients, or doctors and their patients. That's another thing to be mindful of, is there's no way for, a Compass or an Atai or any of the other names out there to go to a doctor administering psilocybin and say, hey, you can't do that. What it really is doing is it's blocking someone. What Compass is trying to avoid is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on clinical trials for this specific polymorph form, and then someone leapfrogging them once it gets through FDA trials and saying, okay, I'm going to forego all of that R&D spend, all of that clinical trial spend, and just start offering it and really leapfrog them and start eating into their market. So it's more of an issue around that of preventing kind of new, I guess, preventing moochers than stopping anyone from growing their own psilocybin or, even therapists using it in Oregon or you name it. So I totally agree. I think it's something companies have to be mindful of. With that said, this is not the issue that keeps me up at night. I mean, pharma's hands are pretty tied in terms of preventing people from using the truly generic forms of these substances. So that's the only other point I'd add.
That's really interesting. Now, Tim, before the panel, we were sort of discussing via email some interesting things that, we could probably chat through during the panel. And you mentioned that one would be this sort of trade-off where biopharma companies have to go through this really rigorous process of clinical trials, spend millions and millions of dollars. And a lot of these trials are expected to fail a lot of the time in exchange for a period of monopoly over their medications. Now, you said that a lot of biotech innovation probably wouldn't occur if this temporary monopoly wasn't guaranteed. Can you elaborate on that a little for us?
Yeah, I think it's easy to have generational forgetfulness here, but we forget about the tragedy of thalidomide, and that was really the birth of the FDA. Thalidomide was a tragic story. It was a teratogen. It caused birth defects, and that was really the impetus for the FDA. Prior to that, you had some other drugs that were advanced, by kind of pseudo doctors. There was one I know that was to remove hair, and so people would use it to remove hair on their legs, but it eventually removed all the hair on their body. So Eleanor Roosevelt, who's kind of this, this real icon for many of us, she led the charge on launching the FDA to say, hey, we need a rigorous review process. We need to really put these through scientific review these claims being made and make sure they pass muster. Now, to go through that process, that's incredibly expensive. I mean, the average clinical trial, even if this is not counting failed clinical trials, will be at least $100 million to get through to commercialization. I think Spravato was a little bit north of 200 million, Janssen Spravato. So they're incredibly expensive. So in order to do that, the fear is I'm going to front all of this capital spend. And then if I get this product to market, if others can just start, leeching on and offering the same product, but they don't have the same CapEx burden, that there's just a huge asymmetry there. So the trade-off we've designed as a society to say, okay, we want these to go through rigorous review is to grant biotech companies a temporary monopoly on that narrow band of IP. So that's I think we kind of forget where this all started with the FDA. And so we've devised this system of that's really the trade-off we say of, okay, to take on that risk and to take on that upfront spend on the back end, you're going to be granted a temporary monopoly. And then eventually that will expire. That goes into the public domain, and that is then owned by the public at that point. So eventually these all do expire and everyone gets access to them. But, sometimes I think we certainly lose sight of that and how expensive these can be. But that's certainly part of the paradigm with all this.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tim. And I think maybe the issue comes up when, there are patents that don't appear to be truly novel or innovative that sort of come on, and there's allegations of evergreening or just sort of hitching on, that you said before. But I think that in addition to that, there are also, in addition to patents, there's also regulatory exclusivities or data protection provisions that might be useful as well to companies undergoing, these expensive trials or, clinical studies as they're bringing a drug to market that are also sort of helpful and maybe, supplemental or alternative approaches to protection.
Yeah. Richard actually brings up a really good point. I think the we always talk about IP, but beyond that domain, I mean, you can, if you're the first to advance a compound to market, the FDA will grant you 5 years of regulatory exclusivity. And then usually there's a 2.5-year stay period also before generics can kind of file and start entry. So you implicitly get 7.5 years, even if you had no intellectual property position. So, that's kind of more in the FDA regulatory realm than IP realm, but in a way it is kind of a way of blocking competitors in a lot of ways. So, and the last thing I was going to mention too, just real quick, was the failure rate on drugs. I think we forget, 8% success rate on small molecule compounds. So a lot of these expensive clinical trials end up in failure. So it's another part of the equation. Sorry,
yeah, I mean, No, go ahead. I mean, you guys bring up a really exclusive, really interesting point. I think data exclusivity in particular is just really fascinating to me. I think the corporate arm of MAPS is sort of going that route as opposed to, going towards patents and IP. A question for you guys as investors, would you consider investing in a company who decided to sort of use those alternative methods as opposed to the traditional IP route? And like why or why not? Why don't we start with you, Richard, and then I'm gonna pick on you, and then we can jump over to him.
That's a tough question. So yeah,
I think that to a certain extent, patents provide some level of comfort for investors, but that being said, I think there are multiple approaches to things, right? And it could be a case specific, right? And the regulatory exclusivities do provide a level of protection, right, going forward for new drugs or their new entrants into the marketplace. And this is a bit of a Canadian flavor, but there's also in Canada there's also a governmental body called the Patented Medicine Price Review Board that caps the prices that you can charge for patented medicines, right? So that's sort of an extra layer of consideration in the Canadian market that goes into whether you even want to pursue a patent strategy in Canada at all, right? If your price of your medicine is going to be capped at a certain amount where it doesn't really make economic or business sense for you, right? You're weighing the advantages and disadvantages of pursuing a patent strategy. So it's nice to have sort of alternative routes to protect the amount of research dollars you put into developing a drug.
Yeah. It's a tough question. I mean, I agree with Richard. I think it would be very case by case. I'd be pretty hesitant to invest in a company that doesn't have some sort of bona fide intellectual property around it. And I will say this, I mean, I think we've kind of gone through a phase 1 of psychedelics and a phase 2. Phase 1 was really the advancement of a lot of these more genericized compounds, whether it was via MAPS or, what Compass was doing. And there's certainly plenty of other players out there in the nonprofit and for-profit sphere. I think that's starting to get a bit saturated. So at Palo Santo, we're starting to lean a little bit more into companies working on new chemical entity drug discovery, where they can really get a composition of matter patent. I think, that's going to be in working on second generation psychedelics that improve on some of the properties from the first generation. So we're really starting to lean into that. And I think the way I think about it is, how wide is your patent? I mean, if you have composition of matter, you have a much wider basis and much just wider kind of moat of protection versus some of the other anti-generic strategies out there, fixed dose combination, chemical manufacturing controls, you name it. It's a lot narrower is the thing. I mean, you can get IP on psilocybin in a salt form for a specific use case, but others can still use psilocybin in their own form or with their own delivery method. So a lot of what we're looking at now really is more in that composition of matter realm. So I'm even more hesitant to say I'd evaluate something that was using kind of one of the less conventional exclusivity pathways, but we'd evaluate it. And the last thing I'd say is, I think we all talk about IP, and it's really a negative right? It's a right to block others from doing what you're doing, but at the end of the day, you have to execute. And the commercial rollout of these, I think, is another really big consideration. You can have all the IP you want, but if you don't roll it out across the right centers or through the right clinicians, it's still going to be a failed product ultimately. So we're investors in a company called Reset Pharma, and they're working on psilocybin for cancer-related depression. And the plan is to roll that out across cancer centers, which I think is it's going to be an effective, commercial rollout strategy. So, IP doesn't solve the whole equation. We have to think about it holistically as investors.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tim. And I just want to echo that is that just because, you have a patent or you have an issued patent, it doesn't mean it's invincible, right? And it's not sort of not open to sort of, challenge or litigation or perhaps other IP that just might be more commercially viable, right? So it's it's a really good point.
Definitely. Question for you guys, just because you guys are both part of funds that actually deploy money into these startups, into these companies working to develop these medications. I'm really curious to know about what the conversation is like when a company is pitching to you. What does the conversation around IP and patents actually sound like? Do you guys usually bring it up first? Are they the ones that sort of say, look at all these, applications we have in? Would love some detail on that. And I'm sure a lot of the viewers listening in are probably, companies that want to get funding and are looking to get more funding. So, I'm sure they're curious as well.
Yeah. I guess Richard got thrown under the bus last time, so I could take the lead on this one. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's definitely a secondary question, I think, in diligence. I mean, the starting questions are always the team, the business model. I mean, the approach there, and really, getting into the science of can this work, and what data do you have to suggest that. So patents are usually, a second call type question, or, even an email thing of, can you send us a list of them, or, this is a lot of this stuff you can dig up on Google Patents as well. But then, beyond that, there's a lot of digging and parsing to try to figure out, okay, you have a provisional filing with all these claims, but what realistically are you actually going to get a utility patent on when you send in the application? And there's a lot of gamesmanship around that, I think, that you see of a lot of companies, having provisional filings. They'll put out press releases. You can get a stock price bump in the case of publicly listed companies, but a lot of those may not hold that much weight. So there's, quite a bit of gamesmanship in trying to figure out on our end, and working with IP attorneys of, okay, what is the prior art out there? How many of these claims can be substantiated? And a lot of patents I see, at least in the initial phases, it's like every drug across every single indication you can name, and even indications I've never heard of. And you're trying to figure out, okay, how many of these are really going to get knocked back, once they go for an application and once an examiner looks at this. So there's never really an easy answer. I found, Richard, you can confirm or deny that, but it's really tough in the early days. I mean, you get these very broad, all-encompassing patents. And I will say, I think Compass gets a lot of flack, but I see this for a lot of companies. It's just part of a negotiating strategy, just like when you buy a home. If you're going to start high, someone's going to start low and you meet in the middle. I think same goes with the patent examiner. If you're going to have all these claims, knowing a good chunk are going to get knocked back, and that's just part of a broader patent strategy. So it's important. And so for us, it's trying to figure out, okay, what do we think can be substantiated, and what will hold weight over the long term?
Yeah, no, Tim, I do agree with you as well there. It's excuse me. It's patents are important to a degree, because it's your ability to protect your invention and what sort of you've sort of put into it. But this is the early days, and there's there's a bit of a meta risk component here, where there's a lot of uncertainty over what's been filed, when it's been filed, and who's filed what. So typically in these kind of situations, and this is what I've been trained to do in the past as well, is you're putting just a lot of detail into these whether they're provisional applications or just regular non-provisional patent applications, because you just don't know what you're going to find when some of these applications come to light, or in the case of psychedelics, maybe some of the non-traditional sources of information come across an examiner's desk, something like that, right? Where you didn't, apart from, like, even though you conducted a diligent search, just these things you just really couldn't find, maybe unless you went out to a community and sort of asking questions. But it's a way to sort of mitigate and offset some of the risk, because you're locked in once you file to what you put in the patent application, and you don't know what the examiner is necessarily going to find. So you need to be able to maneuver around and make changes to the scope of your claims and have it get knocked back, but then just be able to sort of to introduce new concepts that are already in your application that can help to advance your claims, but still but at the cost of restricting them a bit. So it's part of the process, but it is an important consideration in the investment process.
I know we're almost out of time. We have 5 or 6 minutes left. And, I feel like this is a topic that we could talk about for hours, though people may not want to listen to us for hours. So I'm just going to leave you guys with one last question. It seems like this discussion over patents, more of a debate, really, that's been playing out in recent months, especially. Do you feel like people on either side of this camp are going to end up converting to the other? Are they going to end up changing their minds? I feel like there are people who think patents have no place in the psychedelics world. There are people in the middle who think, as long as it's novel, it's fine. Just don't overdo it. And then there are people who say psychedelics is just like any other biotech company. You have to have a really strong patent policy. Where do you see this debate going? Where do you see this conversation going? Do you feel like people are going to change their minds about this? Do you feel like people are just going to stay put? Would love to get your guys' thoughts as this closing remark. Richard, going to throw you under the bus again. Go ahead.
Sure, why not? That's a good question. Well, I'd like to think that whichever side of the debate you're on, that you have an open mind, right? And whether you're on the pro patent side of the debate, that you have an open mind to the broader considerations in the psychedelic space, and the fact that there could be viable alternate approaches, right, to protecting innovation or advancing it through this trial stage in a responsible way. But also on the other side of the debate, where it's very much if you adhere to an anti-patent strategy, I think that it's also important to keep in mind that to get true innovation, sometimes you do need some form of protection in the form of a patent or otherwise. And also, to remember the trade-offs in that those innovations are disclosed, right? So you can look at them, you can build upon them, right? You can research them more, and then it could quicken the pace of innovation in a very important space. So I think there's a balance. I think there are multiple approaches to this. I think the size of the problem is huge, and there really isn't one approach that's going to win the day for everyone. I think it's just a multifaceted approach.
Yeah. I mean, I always joke that, if it's someone else advancing a therapy that you wanted to advance, then, it's open science, no patents, bring down the walls. But if it's something I'm advancing, then all of a sudden, dig the deepest moat you can, have all the IP you can. So, it depends on where people's interests lie. But I tend to think that I think people get a lot more spooked by IP and realize the bark is worse than the bite with a lot of these. I mean, there's a lot more claims that are made than actually end up, getting approved by an examiner. That's one big thing. So no one's going to be able to patent couches or talk therapy or you name it. So that's certainly one aspect. And I think people also realize, how narrow some of this IP is as well, that no one can patent LSD or psilocybin. They can get a crystalline form, a polymorph form of it, or some method of delivery, but that's not blocking others from advancing their own forms of these pretty genericized compounds. And then I think a lot of people just aren't fully aware of how expensive clinical trials are. So if we do want these to go through a medicalized route, which I think there's an emerging consensus around that, then you have to have some commensurate IP around that. So I think initially you read headlines and they sound scary and everything, and headlines rule the day, and 140 character tweets rule the day these days. But once you really drill into this, there's no way I see, any of these companies being able to block a therapist from doing this in Oregon or you name it. So I think ultimately, some who fret over, IP and psychedelics, I think that's going to wane. That's going to continue to wane, would be my opinion. So I think it's something we have to be mindful of, and it's good to, to be vigilant and have everyone on their guard that, no one overclaims or has an onerous patent or you start kind of getting patent trolls emerging in this space. But I do ultimately think people will see that there is value to having IP around psychedelics, and that is a catalyst that is allowing us to fund drug development and really move these forward. And without that, a lot of this investment probably wouldn't occur.
Well, that pretty much is the end of our panel. Tim, Richard, thank you guys so much for taking the time. I hope this discussion was interesting for all of our viewers. So yeah, take care. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Yeji.